months ago, I found myself sitting across from a young political strategist at a crowded coffee shop in D.C. He had just returned from a week-long leadership summit in Budapest, and he was practically glowing with a specific kind of intellectual fervor. He kept pulling up photos on his laptop, not of the Danube or the Parliament building, but of charts and media maps. He described Viktor Orban's Hungary not as a foreign nation, but as a laboratory. He spoke with a giddy, hushed reverence about how clean the political landscape felt there, how the noise of the independent media had been replaced by what he called a coherent national narrative. To him, Hungary was the blueprint for a house he desperately wanted to build in America. He was particularly obsessed with the idea of the supermajority. He kept tapping his finger on the table, saying that the U.S. was paralyzed by its own ghost stories about checks and balances. He felt that Orban had finally figured out how to use the law to neutralize the law, and he saw it as a victory for anyone tired of the slow, messy grind of traditional constitutional democracy. There was a deep-down satisfaction in his voice, a sense that someone finally stopped playing by the old, losing rules. But then the conversation took a sharp turn. I asked him if he'd be comfortable if a leader from the opposite end of the political spectrum used those same centralized powers, the same media control and judicial influence, against his own movement. The excitement evaporated instantly. His expression hardened into something defensive, almost panicked. He started talking about existential threats and national survival, eventually dropping a line that felt chillingly detached. We have to break the machine before they use it to break us. That sudden pivot from celebrating the dismantling of democratic guardrails to a frantic fear of the vacuum left behind perfectly captures the tension currently straining the American experiment. It's a contradictory logic where one side views the erosion of norms as a strategic necessity, while the other views it as a slow-motion collapse. It leaves you wondering, is the United States looking at Hungary as a warning of what to avoid, or is a segment of the country looking at it as a roadmap for what's coming next? Whether it's direct inspiration or just two different nations following the same dark script, we have to ask, has America actually learned anything from the Hungarian model, or is it simply waiting for its turn to try it out?
You know, that conversation at the D.C. coffee shop really sets the exact stage for today's exploration, because you are looking directly at the mechanics of democratic backsliding here.
Right, exactly.
And I mean, to truly understand the reality of this moment, you really have to compare the Hungarian blueprint to the structural realities and, well, the deep cultural fractures we have within the United States. We are examining how institutions designed to protect freedom can be systematically repurposed to dismantle it.
Yeah, and to understand how this actually works in practice, you have to hear the story of András. He is a secondary school teacher in Budapest who has taught civic history for 20 years. And he described this gradual, almost invisible silencing over a decade.
Wow, so it wasn't like an overnight thing.
No, it was never a sudden violent coup. Instead, it was just this series of meticulously planned legal adjustments. His textbooks were quietly rewritten to push a very singular national identity.
Right, the curriculum changes first.
Exactly. And he noticed the local council, which used to be this place of vibrant, heated debate, being slowly filled with appointees who just echoed the prime minister's rhetoric. So to him, the architecture of democracy looked completely intact from the outside, but the rooms inside had been gutted of their purpose.
Image.
Yeah, it is like this illiberal shift is slow setting concrete. Citizens don't notice the walls closing in until they try to speak and suddenly realize no one is allowed to listen.
Well, and that is the defining mechanic of Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy. It is a deliberate rejection of the idea that a democracy must be liberal.
I mean, democracy and liberalism are usually a package deal, right?
I know it sounds contradictory, but Orban's model claims to prioritize the common good and what they call Christian liberty over liberal internationalism. They are actively working to protect traditional culture from what they view as post-national or post-Christian forces.
So they just redefine who the democracy is actually for.
And the tactical execution of this in Hungary was entirely legal. Following a massive electoral victory in 2010, they secured a 2/3 parliamentary supermajority. And with that, they just systematically rewrote the Constitution.
Just like that, because they had the numbers.
Exactly. First, they went after the Constitutional Court. They packed it with loyalists and explicitly removed its jurisdiction over budget and tax laws.
So the court literally couldn't review the government's financial moves anymore. Wild.
And then they attacked the independent judiciary by suddenly lowering the retirement age. They forced out all the senior judges overnight.
Wow, just cleared the bench.
And plus, they recently stripped academic autonomy by putting public universities under the control of private foundations run by political appointees.
Get this. It is as if a sports team won a single championship and used the prize money to buy the referee association, change the dimensions of the field, and rewrite the rule book so the opposing team always has to run uphill.
The game is still technically being played, but the outcome is engineered.
Right, and that brings us back to Washington, D.C., actually. I want to share the story of a former legislative aide who deeply studied this Hungarian transition. He talked about this concept of the exhaustion of the safeguards.
Right.
He realized that the U.S. Constitution is not some impenetrable fortress. It is a complex machine that requires manual maintenance. Sitting there with veteran lawyers, he experienced what he called structural vertigo.
Structural vertigo, like realizing the floor could drop out.
Exactly. It is the terrifying realization that the layers of judicial and federalist checks in America are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them. You know, the idea that it can't happen here is merely a sentiment, not a structural guarantee.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the constitutional structures of the U.S. and Hungary do have some major differences. The U.S. system possesses significant friction, like federalism, a bicameral legislature, and lifetime appointed federal judges.
Right, so a simple parliamentary majority can't just rewrite the U.S. Constitution overnight like Fidesz did in Hungary.
Exactly. And we have highly independent state-level election administration, too. So because of all that friction, we have to distinguish between two paths of decay, authoritarian reversion, and constitutional retrogression.
Okay, wait, what is the difference between those two?
So authoritarian reversion is a rapid, complete collapse like a military coup. That is highly unlikely in the U.S. The real pressing danger for you to watch out for is constitutional retrogression.
And that is the slower one.
Yeah, it is a subtle, incremental erosion of competitive elections, rights of speech, and the rule of law. Because the formal laws are harder to change here, the strategy shifts to delegitimizing institutions.
So attacking the credibility of the media or the courts or intelligence agencies?
Exactly. They attack the electoral systems themselves. While the U.S. structures resist direct legal capture, they are deeply vulnerable to the erosion of unwritten democratic norms.
It sounds like we are relying on the honor system to keep the government running. If the machine's safety valves only work because people feel morally obligated to use them, what happens when a political movement decides that winning is more important than the machine itself?
That is the exact breaking point.
Mm-hmm.
And it trickles all the way down to everyday life, which is where the media ecosystem comes in.
Yeah, it really brings the focus down to a deeply personal level. Think about the story of two brothers living in a polarized American suburb right now. They inhabit the exact same house, but entirely different realities.
Oh, I've seen this dynamic so many times.
Right. One brother is trapped in a social media echo chamber where literally every policy is framed as an existential threat to his cultural identity. Meanwhile, the other watches traditional broadcasts and views his brother's anger as totally fringe.
So their dinner table is just a silent battlefield of identity politics.
And when media ecosystems fracture like that, they stop acting as a mirror of society and become a weapon. Polarization stems from a genuine fear of losing one's place in a changing world. But when identity becomes the only metric for truth, the shared ground required for democracy just washes away.
What's fascinating here is the concept of asymmetric polarization within this ecosystem. Yeah. Conservative media has become a highly insular, tight-knit sphere that circulates information internally.
Like a sealed vault.
Yeah. It often defends political figures unconditionally while demonizing the opposition as enemy combatants. But if you compare how media capture happened in Hungary versus the U.S., the contrast is really striking.
Right, because in Hungary, it was very top-down, wasn't it?
It was entirely state-driven. They created a powerful media council with draconian finding powers, and Orban's allies just bought up or shut down independent papers like Népszabadság almost overnight.
Wow, just bought them out and silenced them. But in the U.S., the state didn't even need to legislate this.
No. A commercially driven partisan media ecosystem achieved a similar epistemic closure entirely voluntarily.
Interesting. We used to argue about what color to paint the house. Now one side is convinced the house is on fire and the other side is convinced the first side is holding a match. You can't compromise on policy when you don't even share the same basic facts about reality.
And the fuel for this engine is a mix of economic discontent and cultural backlash against progressive social changes like diversity and gender equality.
It gives people an easy villain, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Both the U.S. and Hungary use scapegoating heavily. Just look at the intense demonization of figures like George Soros, portraying them as globalist threats to national survival. It transforms political disagreements into literal existential wars.
So bringing all these threads together, the Hungarian model and the American experience really represent two sides of the same coin here. The phenomenon we are witnessing is not a dramatic, cinematic collapse of a democratic system into a dictatorship.
There are no tanks rolling down the street. It is simply the normalization of weakened guardrails.
Exactly. Institutions will remain standing, elections will take place, and courts will function, but their legitimacy will be endlessly contested. The audience retreats into ideological silos.
And democracy is slowly redefined into a system shaped by permanent cultural conflict and the strategic manipulation of institutional loopholes. It is the reality of democratic fatigue.
The next phase of democracy may not be an evolution, but a regression into a state where the system is procedurally intact, but normatively hollow. It leaves behind a machine that goes through the motions of freedom while actively ensuring its own paralysis.